Confirms it. Okay, good morning, everyone. Those online and here. So I think this is going to be the last year on this topic of the influence of history and culture and society on the written Torah. Next week, quick plug, we're going to have a learning morning with 3 sessions going from 9:30 after the later starts due to Hallel through to midday. And we will have a number of distinguished speakers, including Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Breitwitz, who many of you will know, the rabbi of the Sameach Shul and the former professor of law, and Dr. Tova Gunzel, who is the head of the Beis Medrash in Bar Ilan, and a Torah and Halacha scholar, and very, very interesting person also. So that's a plug for those of you who normally come here to the Sunday morning learning. Okay, so this is the last session on influence, and I wanted to look at the matter of Duplitura Colossians b'nei Adam, which literally means the Torah spoke in the language, or speaks in the language of human beings. So the underlying sort of meta message behind everything we've really been discussing is that even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the author of the Torah, is above time and space, the Torah is addressed to us human beings who inhabit the world of time and space. And thus, we saw various suggestions that the style that the Torah adopts, the points the Torah emphasizes, may have been as a reaction or in contrast to some of the myths and stories and non-beliefs or disbeliefs that were floating around at the time. Some of the halachas that the Torah emphasizes may have been as a reaction to that. Again, it's not that Chas v'Shalom we're suggesting a change in the message of the Torah or its values, and simply how it's expressed and the language which is used and the points that are emphasized. The Rambam in Moed Nevuchim, in a sense, goes even further, because he says that even halacha, such as the structure of Kabbalas, is to a degree in a response to pagan worship, to Avodah Zarah worship, though maybe the Rambam sees this as something fundamental to human nature and therefore in that sense above time and space. But the basic message is that the giver of Torah is infinite and above time and space, but we human beings are very much finite who exist in time and space, and the Torah addresses us. We spoke about maybe the Torah reluctantly accommodating certain things which are less than ideal, like slavery, like Yafas Toya, according to Rav Kook, like vegetarian, like eating of meat, even though there's an ideal to have no slavery, to have no Yafas Toya, the beautiful captive lady, to have no meat eating. And again, the Torah responds and adapts as per the thinking of Moed Nevuchim, Rav Kook, two very different thinkers, very far apart both in time and worldview, but nonetheless in this respect overlapping. The idea that the Torah accommodates its message to human beings. Now, today I want to look at a source for this idea in Chazal and how this expression has been used by later thinkers. And the source of this idea in Chazal is the phrase Duplitura Colossians b'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings, or adapts its language of human beings. So, for example, this is a machlokas Tanoim. Rabbi Kiva consistently in Shas, in Medrash Halach and so on, is Doresh Kefelus. He interprets double language in the Torah. So, for example, when it says Shaleach to Shalach, you should surely send, or Shaleach to Shalach, literally ascending, you should send. That's in the context of Shluach Hakan, or Abeid to Abdun, you should surely destroy. Abeid to Abdun, a destroying you should destroy. If a listening you listen, or if you surely listen. What's the meaning of all these double phrases? So Rabbi Kiva says all of these are coming to teach a drush. They're coming to teach us something extra. If the Torah is sort of emphasizing using this kefelus, this kafel, this double language, it must be coming to teach a drush, something extra, an extra halachic detail. Rabbi Shmuel responds and he says, no, Dibra Torah, Colossians b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks like human language, and this is how human language works. So in human language, in Lashon HaKodesh at least, sometimes a double expression is used, and that's when one wants to emphasize things or the like. So at least on a Peshat level, we find this principle of Dibra Torah Colossians b'nei Adam. Again, the Torah is written in multiple layers, and Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel argue in the world of Drush, of can you derive halachas from these kefelus, from this double language or not? But in simple use of language. In Pshat and Pshuta Shel Mikra, it seems it's acceptable, and Rabbi Shmuel holds this even in practical halacha, to say Duplitura Colossians, the Torah spoke in the language of human beings, and we shouldn't find that surprising, therefore, that the phraseology of the Torah is in line with how humans speak. So even in its narrowest use, in the way that we find this phrase, before the Gaonim and Rishonim and Achronim extends it, and we'll see the remarkable ways in which they extend it, but even just the way that it's being used by Chazal, it's already an indication that the language of the Torah is the way we human beings speak. We shouldn't think of Lashon HaKodesh just as some sort of pristine language which only functions in a precise, mechanicalistic, rationalistic way, but we should understand it has a turn of phrase which is appropriate to the humans who are being spoken to and to how we human beings operate. So says Rabbi Shmuel. Again, I'm not suggesting this is exactly comparable to saying that this is something that alters in time, and maybe this is something fundamental to how human beings think, but nonetheless it's a source in Chazal for the idea that this is that the Torah is being expressed in a way which is applicable to the human beings who are reading the Torah. Now, the Rambam in his Mo'en Avuchim famously extends this to anthropomorphisms, to the use of language in the Torah when it's trying to express abstract ideas, particularly abstract ideas about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, about Hashem. So we are familiar again with this, and the Rambam's thinking of this has become so all-pervasive that we almost take this as a premise of Yiddishkeit. We don't think that there's any other way of viewing this, or this was ever a matter of debate or discussion. So this is one area where not just the Rambam, but the Gaonim also, Rav Sadigan and others, their thinking has really become mainstream. This is expressed by the Rambam in his Mo'en Avuchim, of course, but it's also expressed by the Rambam in his Halach, in his Mishnah Torah, in his Yesod HaTorah. This is found in Yesod HaTorah Perek Aleph. So it's not just something in the Guide to the Perplexed, which was perhaps only designed for professional philosophers. It's something for the Rambam's halachic work, which he thought was for everyone. And Rambam says, when it says Yad HaChazaka, the strong hands, or Zroya Netuya, the outstretched arm of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this isn't to be taken literally. This is Duplitura Colossians. So he takes the Chazal, which wasn't used in this way, and he uses it in a far broader sense. Now here, he doesn't just mean Duplitura Colossians, this is a human turn of phrase, like double language, Im Shemoyah Tishman or Shaleach Teshalach. He means by that the Torah speaks in accordance with how we human beings think and conceive. We humans are remarkable. We are exceptionally abstract beings. We think in very, very abstract terms, and yet we don't really have an ability to express that other than in the most concrete and physical of terms. And I've said this before, and I repeat it again because it bears repeating. The degree to which we are abstract thinkers is astonishing, is astounding. A 2-year-old is already exceptionally abstract, is already conceiving of abstract entities that nowhere exist in the physical world. So as soon as we use vocabulary, if a little child looks at this thing in front of me and says, "What is this?" and I respond, "This is a table," they are recognizing that this physical table in front of me is a member of an abstract class called table. And despite the fact that they can feel and taste and touch and chew the physical table in front of them, they can't feel they can really connect to it until they understand what it is and they can link it to an abstract concept, the concept of table, of tableness. Now, what is this table? When I say this is a table, what's this table that I'm talking about? What shape is this table? What color? How big is it? What material is it made of? And of course, the answer is none of those. They are conceiving of a table that's abstract, that doesn't have a shape and a size and a color and a material. How many legs does it have? Is it made of plastic or metal or wood? How large is it or small of it? It's none of those, because it's an abstract concept of which this physical table in front of me is a mere example. So children are already engaging very profoundly with Platonic forms from a very young age. We just don't think of it in those terms. By the way, we experience this the whole time. If you ever read a book and then watch a film, there's always a sense of discord when you see a character in the film that doesn't quite match your reading of the book. Now, the point is that no matter how they would have expressed this character, there would have been the same discord. Because when you read the character, you didn't picture the character as a physical being. So you didn't conceive of the hair color of the character, or the length of the character's nose, or how long their beard was, or whatever it may be, because none of that was necessary for how the character worked. We were capable of holding this character in our head and relating to the character in a very, very real way without needing to fill in any of the details other than those that were relevant to the plot. So if it's relevant to the plot that they were bald, then baldness would be a feature of how I picture them, but nothing more than that. So we conceive of the character as abstract, and therefore there's always a sense of a lesseningness of the character. When we see the character expressed physically, there's always that initial sense of sort of disappointment. There's a trade-off between the pleasure of seeing this sort of character embodied as a real human being versus the loss of this character as an abstract entity. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why there are very strong traditions not to draw direct pictures of the Avos or Imos or characters from the Torah. This isn't because of a sort of Avodah Zarah type sentence. We don't ascribe godliness to any of these beings, but it's simply because we wish to leave them more abstract. Avraham Avinu, we know enough about him, meaning as a concept, as a human, we're told a lot of information about him. We don't need to sort of physically express him as was he wearing a turban or a shawl, or how long was his beard, or what shape were his ears. None of that is relevant to the story, and therefore we wish to leave these characters as more conceptual, abstract beings, because actually we relate to them more fully when they're abstract than when they're real. So this is a very profound matter of how we humans think. And yet we can only communicate in very physical terms. When we talk, we have to talk using, I've said this before, using bits of meat flapping inside our mouths, causing another airways to go, causing another bit of meat to flap inside our eardrums. And we can only use concrete terms, use. We can only express. All of these are physical vocabulary. We don't have a way to talk directly about concepts. And this is spoken about by Plato and others. This is not a uniquely Jewish idea, but it's a fact of human nature, of how we work, right? How we operate. These are all physical terms. We can only borrow physical language in order to express abstract ideas. So this is a fundamental of human nature, and therefore the Rambam adapts this to Duplitura Colossians. We shouldn't see this as a diminution of Torah. There's simply the Torah is speaking to human beings. Humans can only express even spiritual ideas, ideas about monotheism and about God, who of course is above having arms and legs, in physical language. And again, I can't stress the degree to which the Torah is full of this. Einei Hashem lekecha, right? The eyes of Hashem are on this. Yoshe b'shmaim yischak. This is the Rambam's example. The one who sits in heaven laughs. He neither sits nor does he laugh. In essence, Vayom Hashem al Moshe, right? Hashem, every time, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe. What's his speech? What's his amira? It's the expulsion of air from our vocal cords, causing sound waves to go. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have vocal cords. He can't speak. So it means communication, but we don't have a way of expressing the transfer of ideas other than using this sort of terminology. So this is one extension of the concept of Duplitura Colossians as found in the Rambam in his important Moed Nevuchim work. The Ralbag uses a similar concept in another setting, actually one that ties up more with what we were speaking about previous weeks when we were looking at the style of communication in the Torah. So the Ralbag was a Rishon, a Reb Levi ben Gershon. We're talking about late 1200s to mid 1300s, born in Spain actually, and one of these figures who combined everything. So he wrote a parish in the Gemara. He was a mathematician. He was a doctor. He was an astronomer, stroke astrologer. Of course, in those days the distinction wasn't entirely clear. Born in France, very, very heavily influenced by the Rambam. Wrote a philosophical work called Sefer Milchomas Hashem, the Sefer of the Wars of God. So he's battling for the truth and about the belief of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which he spent an enormous number of years, more than a decade, in writing, somewhat modelled on the Moed Nevuchim. And he says something which modern day academics have really found evidence of. He's speaking about the length of I'll put this piece of paper in my this anyway. He's speaking about the length, the style. Here we are. He's speaking about the literary style of the Torah, and he says, I just want to read this out. This is the Ralbag in Sefer Shmos. He says, I don't understand how much repetition there is in the Torah. So this is relevant to, for example, the story of the message of Eliezer when he goes and chooses a wife for Yitzchak. He's commenting in Sefer Shemos on the description of the building of the Mishkan, because of course we have the building of the Mishkan basically twice. We have the instructions for the building of the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan itself. And therefore he conjectures, he says, perhaps this was the convention or the consensus of literary style at the time, and the Torah expresses itself through the style that was appropriate at the time for how things, for how works should be written, and maybe aesthetic sensibilities change over time. He says this is a piece of conjecture. Now we know this, for example, from anyone who reads even works that were considered great in the Victorian era. But there's a whole difference in style, in the length of chapter headings and the wordiness of how they express aesthetic taste. No one would read a book like that, and yet these books were mass sellers, right? These were populist books back even only 150 years ago. So we know that style of writing changes. So the Ralbag suggests that maybe this is something to do with the style of writing. He says in Peshat again, he's not saying this is the whole meaning of the Torah. He's aware of the Chazals that are Dorish things from this, and the Chazals that speak about the love that's expressed in Yofes is Choson of the Ovos, that the Torah elaborates more on stories around the slaves of the Ovos than it does about the children, because of for whatever reason, the love the Torah wants to express. Enormous amount of Torah has been generated by understanding these two descriptions. The Rabbah says on a Peshat level, it is acceptable to say maybe this is a matter of style, influenced by style and how it works at the time. Now, the Ralbag expresses this as a conjecture. He didn't have access to ancient works. When I say we, I mean human beings, researchers, academics, have now discovered a lot about literature in the past, and we have discovered that the Ralbag's conjecture is absolutely right. This was a style and a feature at the time. If you wanted to emphasize something, you would write it twice, you would elaborate it on a lot. I'm not going to go into details. We discussed last week some of Sefer Devarim and how it can be understood in terms of writing at the time. The Ralbag has things to say around that also. But basically, the Ralbag is taking this idea and extending it from the way the Gemara uses it, which is use of turns of phrase, the way the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim uses it, which is about abstract ideas expressed in physical language, through to his suggestion, which is a literary style of the Torah might be influenced by styles which were conventional at the time. Now, again, I want to emphasize, for the sake of intellectual honesty, the Ralbag does not reflect mainstream Jewish thinking on this. He was a Rishon in wide respect. So he is a Rishon amongst the Rishonim. His Sefer was one that was treated seriously by the Rishonim. Nonetheless, it does not reflect widespread thinking on the matter. I don't want to be accused, nor to engage in sort of data mining. I'm simply saying that this is a path that we find amongst the Rishonim. It's a path in Peshuto Shel Mikra. The same Ralbag who said this also wrote a Perush on the Gemara in Brachos and several commentaries on Agadas and Sukkos, in which he's perfectly happy to go with the droshes of Chazal, in which Chazal are doresh words in a certain way. He's not a Karaite. He isn't arguing with the droshes of Chazal. He's simply saying that this is a legitimate reading of the Psukim and enhances understanding of how Torah works. So again, I think this is an important remark, particularly for those who are interested in these matters and engage in worrying about how these texts work. This is the view of the Ralbag, in which he extends Duplitura Colossians significantly further than it's generally understood. Now, where else can we take this idea? So here I'm going to lean heavily on the writings of more recent thinkers, in particular of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in particular Rav Kook and the like, who also thought and worried about these ideas and discussed them. So first of all, a piece from Rav Hirsch that comes from one of his letters that he wrote, in which he addresses the famous upset that was caused around the time of the Copernican revolution, the revolution in the model of the understanding of the solar system. So based on what we call the model of Ptolemy, the model of Ptolemean model, the heliocentric view of the solar system, the Earth-centric view of the solar system, in which the Earth is at the center and the sun and the moon and the stars go round. And this was understood by everyone to be how the how the universe works, not just the solar system, but the whole of the universe works. And this is assumed by the Greeks, and this is understood by the Rambam, and you end up with this very complicated mathematical model of the spheres. And this is how everyone understands its work until it begins becoming questioned by thinkers in the 1500s. Now, Jews are very conscious of what's going on around this discussion, as of course, more famously are the Catholic Church and others. For example, Copernicus operates in Krakow some of his life. He's born in Prussia, but he goes and studies in Krakow. Krakow at the time is a Renaissance city. I will be in Krakow actually in a couple of weeks' time. I should mention there will not be a Sunday share in 2 weeks' time. I'll be leading out, if we're able to travel, I'll be leading our school Poland trip. And Krakow is a very beautiful Renaissance city, as the University of Krakow and so on. Obviously, we go primarily there for other reasons, but we do spend a bit of time looking at some of these things. And in Krakow live important Jewish figures like the Ramah, of course, and SheBichtav and others. They have students who are shared between themselves and the University of Krakow. They have students who are studying both Torah and the yeshiva and also engaging academic work. By the way, this is one of my frustrations around this sort of, I may have said this to this group before, but this pseudo presentation of Jewish history, in which there's sort of this myth of the divide between, I mentioned it in the Cosmology, I think, this myth of the divide between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi world, and it's only Sephardim who engaged significantly with philosophy and so on. The Ramah himself was learned Mo Nevuchim very significantly. He references it in his works, even in his commentary on Shulchan Aruch and certainly his Shuvas, he recognizes it. There wasn't this sort of unbreakable divide in which, one half of Jewry knew about, that there were Kabbalists and those who were opposed to philosophy in the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi worlds, and the Kabbalists and those who were opposed to philosophy, and there were those who were pro-philosophy in both worlds. And there's absolutely documented this idea that somehow this is a sort of unique phenomena in the Spanish and Portuguese world is not really entirely accurate. So the Ramah and the Tosis Yomtov and so on had Talmidim that shared this. And as we know, the Catholic Church felt that this new heretical view of a heliocentric solar system in which everything is going around the sun is against scriptures, is against Tanakh, because the Tanakh talks very clearly about the sun rising and setting. We had this again a couple of sessions ago as one trivial example amongst many examples of Bar Hashems, right? The sun has set, the sun has moved. And famously again, the Catholic Church responded by trying to censor this heretical scientific worldview. And there were Jews who responded similarly, by the way, for the sake of, again, intellectual honesty. It was never the same degree of fuss in the Jewish world. There was never as much upset around this as there was in the Catholic world, for two reasons. One is because we never had the power to imprison people, and therefore, in a sense, it was all academic. Though there was the possibility of cherem and the like, but we don't find haramim being applied to people who are proponents of this view. And the second reason is because there was a strong tradition in Yiddishkeit, in Torah, of interpreting these languages, these turns of phrase in an allegorical or metaphorical sense, or to put it more coherently in our language, Duplitura again, Colossians, Bnei Adam. The Torah is speaking in human language, and our experience of this is again human. So this is expressed most clearly in a letter, as I mentioned, by Rabbi Shimshon Falhash. And again, this represents a very traditional thinking. Again, I want to emphasize this isn't quite the same as our question about social, cultural, historical influences on Torah, because this remains a fact of human experience for all time, presumably, whilst we are based on planet Earth. Maybe if we ever explore the stars, it will become different. But for now, this is how we experience the sun and the relative motion of the sun. So this is an effect on the language of Torah, on the way it expresses itself based upon human experience. Nonetheless, it is a technical scientific inaccuracy, perhaps, based upon how we humans use language and how we experience things. So this is another example of this phenomena. I should mention, by the way, that I'm using this as a source simply because it was around this debate about the heliocentric model that this discussion arose. In post Einstein, in a sense, this whole thing becomes a little bit academic, because the movement is relative, really, and therefore neither model is correct or incorrect. You can choose any arbitrary point and take that as your fixed point, and have everything else relative to that. So if you wish to do so, you can take the Earth as the center, as the unmoving point, and you can have the sun and the moon and the stars and everything else moving around the Earth. The only reason we don't adopt that stance in modern day science is because it just makes the maths really, really complicated and difficult, and therefore it's simpler to take it. Neither model is correct, right? Of course, the Earth is revolving around the sun, but the sun itself is revolving around the center of gravity of the galaxy, of the Milky Way, and the Milky Way itself is revolving around in the universe. So nothing is static. We currently, and we don't really have a framework in which to speak about which is static. There's no absolute framework in which we can say this is moving. All movement is relative to each other. So in essence, actually, funnily enough, this debate has become irrelevant. Neither terminology is more correct than the other. I simply mention it as an example of where figures like Rav Shimshon Rosh were willing to go with this. And again, they weren't bothered by this. They were content with the idea that the Torah is expressing itself in metaphoric language. Someone has written here a question, so I'll just pause to take this for a minute, if I can find it. Someone asked, are they correct that there were a number, albeit few, early commentators who did understand the words of the Torah literally, that Hashem does have an outstretched arm, whatever is meant by that? So were there those who disagreed with the Rambam and took Zerah Natuya or Yod Chazak literally? In other words, this expression, this innovation of the Rambam, when it extends the concept of Duplitura Colossians B'nei Adam to these languages, anthropomorphic languages used about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which human languages adopt to describe Hashem. Is this a consensus of Jewish thought, or whether those who disagreed with it, was there anything controversial? So I alluded to this because I didn't want to go into it. And I said that we nowadays just all assume the Rambam, and we don't even question it because we're brought up on this and we sort of take it for granted. In this area, the Rambam has won the argument decisively, right? No one thinks differently to the Rambam about this matter. We're not sure is the answer. What did people pre-Sadia Gaon and the Rambam think about this? Were there authoritative thinkers who disagreed, or were they merely responding to the masses who perhaps weren't aware of this? Was the innovation of the Rambam and Sadia Gaon in sort of hammering this home and bringing it home to everyone, but sophisticated thinkers always understood like that? Or were there sophisticated thinkers who disagreed and took these phrases literally? And if there were, what are we meant to make of these sources? Now, there's several sorts of sources that are used to suggest that there were thinkers who took these ideas literally and did think about reading these terms in the literal sense. The problem with some of these sources is it's unclear whether they themselves were simply using anthropomorphic language or not. So the fact that not everyone spells out clearly like the Rambam does, that I don't mean this literally, I mean it metaphorically or conceptually, doesn't necessarily mean that's not what they're doing. That's the problem with works. I've spoken before, when you read the text, what assumptions are you bringing to the text? And we don't really know what the assumptions of these authors were and how obvious these things were. So there is a work called SheBichtav, which speaks about the dimensions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's corporeal being. So if you understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a corporeal being, some sort of body, it clearly isn't like human bodies. It's far of greater stature. So how big is it? Right? What does it look like? SheBichtav discusses these things. However, the SheBichtav is understood by most thinkers as being a Kabbalistic work, which is expressing Kabbalah ideas when we talk about the dimensions of these matters. So it's very, very hard to define determinant sources around this matter. And I want to be sensitive to this because certainly the psak halacha, if you like, if as much as we can use that term in philosophical things, and I think we can to a degree, is like the Rambam, that is almost laughable or heretical to think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu as having a physical body. We don't really understand what that would mean. So I think we should be careful about using this language with any degree of confidence. There's another work which stems from the school of the Bali Tosfos, Ramosha Taku. Taku was the area he came from, Ramosha Taku. He wrote a Ksav Tomim, his work is called. We have it, it's been published in recent years. A friend actually was involved in a republication of it. Ksav Tomim, Ramosha Taku. And he belongs to the world of Ashkenaz, or France rather, but he belongs to the Ashkenazi world. He's an opponent of seemingly an opponent both of Maimonidean thinking and Gaonic philosophy, and also an opponent of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, the Rekeach, the world of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, who are pietistic, Kabbalistic, philosophical movements. Very, very, very interesting phenomena. We're not talking about what we call Hasidim from the Baal Shem Tov in the 1600s. We're talking about a movement in the 1200s. Hasidei Ashkenaz, a couple of generations after Rashi, very, very famous and important names. They're given the name HaChassid, so Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. When we talk about Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, why do we refer to him as Yehuda Chassid? Because he was a Chassid, not with the Strauman and Payas, but a member of the movement of Hasidus that arose there. We know the works of this movement, by the way. The most famous works of this movement are the Anim Zemiris and the Shirei HaKavod. Anim Zemiris is one of many beautiful poems they wrote in the Yom Kippur Rosh Hashanah Machzor. I think in the Yom Kippur Machzor you have them, the Shirei HaKavod. Aminag is not to say them. I don't know why they're beautiful. Maybe we can reintroduce them and extend that davening by a couple of hours. In Munk Statu, in Statu, yeah. Very, very beautiful and difficult poetry, which combines Kabbalah and philosophy ideas. Very, very interesting. If you ever have some spare time to look at the English translation, and full of anthropomorphisms, by the way. We know this from Anim Zemiris. Keshet Tefillin, right? So Hashem showed Moshe the kesher tefillin, the knot of his tefillin on the back of his neck. Now, no one thinks that the Hasid Ashkenaz meant this literally. This is poetry. Everyone understands it's a metaphor, right? Keish Bachuros, right? He looks like a young man. Just look at the language of Anim Zemiris, full of very, very vivid poetry. But in the case of the Hasid Ashkenaz, we understand it's poetry. No one, and we know much more about their works. They've written Sforim. It's been very extensively discussed. We know, but there was an opponent of theirs, Ramosha Taku. Now, Ramosha Taku does seem to criticize those who are unwilling to accept the descriptions of the Torah as Royanatu and say that these are metaphorical or allegorical language or Duplitura Colossians, and that they should be taken as anthropomorphisms, but not to be taken literally. Now, here we have to proceed with care, because this does not mean to say that Ramosha Taku thought Hashem had an arm and a leg. It means to say that Ramosha Taku is arguing for a surrender of human reason. He's saying at this point, we need to admit that all we have of access to the divine is the Torah's description. And he's disagreeing with the Rambam that we should start using philosophy to analyze these terms. He says you're trying to fight the Torah, you're trying to use philosophy to fight the Torah. He accuses the Rambam of limiting God's ability. And he says if this is how God is willing to describe himself, we need to accept that. We shouldn't be fighting the Torah. Is it possible, conceivable of God to put himself in a physical form were he to so choose in order to appear in front of humans? Perhaps he could. And the Torah says in the again and again about Sinai, remember that you do not see any tamuna, you didn't see any image. A person can't see me and live, which can be read as a philosophical statement. You saw no image at Sinai because God has no image. No one can see me and live because the human mind can't conceive of the infinite. Or it can be taken literally, and he's arguing for literalist interpretation, which is, if you would see me, you would die. But it's not that it is above my power and my ability to present myself in this manner, were I to so choose. We've spoken before in this forum, in the Sunday morning series, about Rav Sadi Gaon's thesis that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't perform logical impossibilities. And Moshe Taka argues with that. He says, you're trying to apply human categories to God. And to some degree or other, he's onto something. He doesn't need my agreement to that. But the Rav Sadi Gaon and the Rambam are also aware of this criticism and would agree with it in a certain precise way. When we ask the question, can Hashem create this square triangle? Rav Sadi Gaon says we can conclusively answer, no, he cannot. Because a square triangle is a concept about which we have ownership. We know what they mean, and a triangle means a three-sided object, a square means a four-sided object. You can't create a three-sided object with four sides. This is a contradiction in time. This is meaningless. He doesn't see this as an imitation of Hashem, because ultimately Hashem is above dimensions, above space. The world of words and logic is itself the product of creation. All that Sadi Gaon is pointing out is that we can't conceive of that which is above time and space, because we don't have vocabulary to think of it. We can't, there's nothing intelligent we can say about that. So, in essence, Moshe Taka is simply arguing that the Torah should be read as a text above and beyond that. We shouldn't try and restrict and limit the Torah to the tools of, with the tools of logic and reason. He's an anti-philosophy philosopher, but there's an important message in what he's saying. A close figure to that, actually, in a very different way, is Nachman of Breslov. who's very, very sophisticated. I've spoken about his works in my Wednesday night series, I think, a while back. He's also an anti-philosopher. In other words, he's arguing for a conscious limitation to human reason. I think maybe even in this forum, I discussed with Nachman and Bessel once. Okay, I mean, he argues using human reason that that the furthest point that human reason can get us to is an awareness of the limitation of human reason. This is his argument. And Ramesh Otaku may well be, I'm no expert on these matters, but it seems to me that that's his philosophical stance. Also, that it's not that he believes that God has an arm and a leg. It's simply saying the Torah says that the most we can understand of godliness is to take that phrase as it is, and we shouldn't try and circumscribe it or limit it based on human reason.
If he is actually saying that God could or might assume human form, that's a bit dangerous in regard to Christianity.
It is dangerous, but it doesn't make it untrue. In other words, the Jewish objection there may not be the possibility or impossibility. It may be that Hashem has said he won't do it because Kilo Yiranu Adam L'chai. It may be that we happen not to believe that this particular figure who his message was contradicting the halachic system. Kishmarka says in Dvarim, I won't change my mind. I'm not a human being that changes my mind. We believe the bris is not an Old Testament, an Old Covenant, but a permanent covenant. So there may be, it may be unsettling for us to conceive of the possibility that there was a Jewish thinker who could imagine an embodied God, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't such a thinker. Having said that, though, to my mind, the evidence remains very, very wishy-washy around this whole subject. When we learn texts, you need to know what assumptions the text brings. There's discussion around Rashi, who never indicates a discomfort with the Torah's use of anthropomorphisms. And on the contrary, when we talk about Yad Hashem, he says Yad Mamish, literal Yad. So what's Rashi saying? The problem is Rashi never does overt philosophy. Rashi is a type of medrash. Traditional Jewish philosophy wasn't done in Greek style, with like the Ralbag or the Moen Avuchim does, in which they sort of systematically work through philosophical ideas. It was done in a literary style. Medrash is poetic philosophy or literary philosophy. It's like an author, a Shakespeare, has enormous insight in psychology and philosophy. He doesn't express it in philosophical terms or psychological terms. He expresses it in character development and literature. This is how Jews did thinking. In the Agadah of Chazal, the Agadah section of Chazal, they tell stories, they tell tales, they express ideas through medrash. So Rashi is part of that tradition. That's how Ashkenazim did philosophy. They continued medrash. So Rashi never steps back in the way that we would want. We're Greek. We've become Greekified to a greater or lesser degree, and we want Rashi to step back and do what the Rambam did and tell us his philosophy. But he never does. Chazal never did that. They never stepped back and sort of told us. The Torah is not, Gemara is not a systematic presentation of concept. You want to learn a halachic concept. You have to learn 15 or 20 sugyas and piece them all together. And Chazal prided themselves on that. They felt there was something inorganic about the other type of thinking. The real world is organic, in which you revisit things again and again from different angles and different directions. And out of that, something emerges, which is a picture. It's above and beyond. The problem with a Rambam, the reason we're all fascinated by Rambam now is because he speaks to the modern mind. And by that, including Lomdas, Briskas, right? The Rambam overtly expresses concepts. So we like that sort of systematic thinking of directly addressing the concept. But there is a limitation in that approach, in which it also becomes more limited. It's a bit like we were talking before about the film versus the book. And you're concretizing it immediately. Whereas if you use poetry, there are many who believe, and myself included, that poetry and literature and metaphor can express truths a little deeper than the language of philosophy, right? And Rashi and Medrash and Agadah and Chazal were working in poetry. They didn't want to have an encyclopedia Talmudist article in which everything about Motzi Shemra or everything about everything about Davar Shenim Miskavi is expressed in a systematic way. They wanted to visit it again and again and again from different angles until a sort of greater truth emerged. And it was really only with the dawn of modernity that Jews began writing halachic works like this. So we have the Shmaitza, in which he says, I'm going to lay out everything there is to say about Sfeikus in the Torah, about Sofik, about doubts, about Chazakah, about assumptions. And it's a beautiful halachic work, invaluable in practical halacha, about standards of evidence and clarification and what to do when you're in situations of doubt, and Roiv, majority and minority and bittul and everything you'd want to know about it. But this is a work that's a product of the dawn of modernity, in which there's that sort of systematic laying out. So Rashi, it's very hard when you're dealing with a work that's so fundamentally different to how we want him to express himself, to know exactly what is meant by all of that.
Drawing the line, if you take the Torah as an instruction, manual, as it were, telling us to live in the way Chazal interpret it. So take an example of Mavushal about the carbon paste.
Yes.
So many halachas. All right, there's an argument between the different people as to what if the word is extra and to learn to use it. But we're learning things of Minat Torah that if you do it wrong and you get it wrong and you mavushal something like the Erbion, and everything, you actually are over an assay. So if it's an instruction booklet, as it were, you've got to take these double lashon. You can't just say, well, it's an expression of man. The Torah is using the lashon. We're actually learning things that if you get it wrong,
so two points to say there. The question that was asked was, but surely these double expressions are used for halacha, and these aren't trivial halachas. These are serious halachas, which, if you get them wrong, have potentially serious implications, like in how the carbon pasach is brought, or whatever the particular example that Leonard was giving it. So 2 points to make about this. The first is we have no way but to confront that problem, because the fact is that in halacha, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Kiva are arguing whether Duplitura Colossians. That's not the Rambam's fault or Rav Hirsch's fault or the Rambam's fault. That's not later thinkers. That is a machlokas in Chazal. That's number one. And the second point to mention is that the extension of the later thinkers is by and large in the world of ideas and philosophy and machshava and drush and belief and so on. And pshat, how we learn pshat. One of the things that stopped Judaism fragmenting into many different branches, at least what we would call Orthodox Judaism, it was submission to halacha. So as much as there's debate in Agadah and in Medrash and in concept and in Pshutei Shel Mikra, all these thinkers accepted the halachic conclusion of how Chazal read these psukim. Why did they accept the halachic conclusion? Either because they understood the Torah is interpreted on many levels, or because they understood that this was a legitimate reading, which was the reading that the halachists came out with. Why should our reading of psukim determine how we do halacha? Listen to the recordings of my Shurim and Torah SheBichtav, which we spoke about halacha being a partnership between how we humans hear the Dvar Hashem and what emerges from that. If you look at the great debates in Jewish history, most of them ultimately revolved around halacha. People who, as long as there was subservience to the halachic system, the philosophical debates very, very rarely lingered. So if you look, for example, at the rise of Hasidus, a lot of the early fear was around halachic matters. Were Hasidim delaying the time of davening? Were they changing the form of how shechita was done, the type of knife that was used for shechita? As soon as it became apparent that Hasidim were not going to be halachic revolutionaries, the debate calmed down. As upset as non-Hasidim were with Hasidim and Hasidim were with non-Hasidim, we all ended up really. It didn't end up as a debate and in all segments of Klal Yisrael. You have either Hasidim or neo-Hasidus, and people learn and are happy with the Torah of Hasidim. The debate calmed down. With Chabad, for all the fuss, and there was 20, 30 years of very, very serious tension, and there were frustrated thinkers who were more philosophically inclined. He said, why aren't we going crazy with them, right? What's going on over here? James Berger wrote his articles and so on. But at the end of the day, nothing ever really lingered from that. And as much as some of us may warm to Chabad, others of us may deeply non-warm, diswarm to them, cool to them, may not feel comfortable with what they're doing. No one is waging a battle over this, because at the end of the day, they're from Jews who are keeping halacha. So halacha determines what is the foundation, the anchor. More than Jews think we do speak. Judaism is a system of, it's a plumbing system, it's a framework, it's an action-based system, which is and I call it a framework because we then have to fill it with meaning. And different Jews may choose to fill it with meaning in different ways, but we all need to fill it with meaning. We can say we can learn Hilchos Brachos in detail. We can say every bracha on food correctly, but at the end of the day, if we're not using the brachos as a tool to think about appreciation of what we have and to be aware of the gift of life and everything we have that Hashem has given us, then we've missed the whole point of brachos. It's meant to be a way of connecting ourselves to Hashem, of raising God consciousness, of raising awareness of Hashem in our lives. So halacha can't do that. Halacha can't change the inside. All it can do is create a system of prompts and nudges and pushes and spurs and then think about this and a framework which we then need to fill with meaning. And inevitably, each of us as individuals is going to fill it with slightly different meaning, and there's going to be schools of thought that fill it with radically different meanings. The Mekubalim will fill it with Kabbalistic kavanas, and the Maimonideans will fill it with philosophical ideas. The filling with meaning is up to us. Within limits, I don't mean completely up to, but there's debates around that within the Jewish world. The structure, the framework that operates it is one which is what maintains what we mean by an Orthodox Jew. I'm conscious of the passage of time, and I really just want to mention two more things just for the sake of completion. before I stop today. I see these are things that interest people, and I'm happy again to. I'd love one day. I just suspect I'll get no one turning up to give a share on was the Rambam a brisker? I think that's a very fascinating subject. To what degree was the Rambam thinking as conceptual as the briskers like to claim? Being somewhat of a brisk myself, my answer would be he was actually. I think he was, and I think just like in philosophy, in halacha also. So maybe I've ruined the punchline, and never no one will come. But there's a lot to talk around these ideas about what was going on in the era of the Rambam and why that developed, and why similar things were happening in the 1600s, and the counter-reaction from things like Nachman of Breslov, who was fascinated by the limits of human reason and madness. I'll just tell very, very briefly one story from Nachman of Breslov, which I think I've shared before, but that indicates these ideas. And apologies if I'm repeating myself here. Nachman Breslov tells a story of, he tells stories, by the way, he teaches through stories. Again, he goes back, he's consciously adopting the system of medrash to teach, and poetry and metaphor and literature. He's trying to fight this trend that he doesn't like in Jewish thinking. He sees Jewish thinking as becoming more westernized. He says, you're going to this sort of systematic philosophy. Don't you realize the limitations of philosophy? Let's go back to storytelling. And he teaches through storytelling. And just one example of many, many stories that express these ideas is a king who has a dream. And in the dream, he dreams that the wheat harvest of next year has become ruined by certain fungus, and whoever eats this wheat harvest will go mad. So he calls in his most trusted advisor, and he says, what should we do? We can't build up supplies enough that no one will eat the wheat next year. There's not enough wheat supplies. If we tell everyone that this wheat will make us go mad, we'll have revolution, we'll have revolt, we'll have a mass famine. So we're stuck. What do we do? So they talk together, and they come to the conclusion, we'll have to let everyone else, sadly, in our population eat the wheat, and just we won't eat the wheat. But then they say, what an unpleasant life this will be. We'll be the only sane people in a world of lunatics and madness. That's going to be horrible. So we're also going to eat the wheat. The only point is we will put a mark on our forehead. So at least when you look at me and I look at you, we will both remember that we've gone crazy, that we've gone mad. That's the story, end of story of Nachman Breslov. So this is a horrible story and a dark story and a very depressing story. There's one amongst many, many, many that Nachman Breslov tells, in which he says the greatest wisdom we humans can aspire to is to know that mark on our forehead, to know that we're mad, to know that our ability to reason is limited, to know that we can't philosophize our way out of this mess. And I want to emphasize again, as someone who does my best to philosophize in my very limited ability, there's so much truth in this, meaning to say that when you probe philosophy in depth, good philosophy leads you to an awareness of the limitations of human reason also. And it's legitimate for a Jewish therefore to therefore say that the limitations, and the Rambam was aware of this, right? Mona Vuchman is as much a work about the limitations of human reason as it is about the ability of human reason. And therefore it's legitimate for a thinker to raise the possibility, well, maybe let's stop reasoning if we're not going to get anywhere. And there's room for discussion. And something like that is Ramosha Taku's criticism of the Rambam, in which he says, the Torah describes Hashem as having Yod Chazaka. That's enough for me. I'm going to go with that. I don't know what it means. I understand the problems with it, but I'm not interested in that. I'm living in a different world. I'm in a world in which I'm happy to go with the narrative of the Torah, and I don't need to think beyond that. So that's my personal take on the corporealism that one finds in the sources. I've done my best to honestly look at as many of the sources that are claimed as I can, and that's how it appears to me. I want to just finish off with two more examples of this, and then I will stop just for the sake of completion. I was asked here by the way in the group, what did Rav Hirsch say? Again, just to summarize, Rav Hirsch is the one who looked at sunrise, sunset, and said that this is a form of Duplitura Colossians. Rav Hirsch speaks about Rakia, by the way. I'll just mention Rakia. The Torah speaks about the creation of Rakia. So we're talking about Bereshis, very, very all text in the Torah is important, but we're talking about the 6 days of creation, and the Torah talks about Rakia. So when we learn Rakia in school, we translate it as sky. The literal meaning of the word rakia, though, etymologically linked to a thin, we have this in Sefer Shmos when it talks about hammering out, beating out thin plates of gold. We have Balkura here was.
Yeah, I was taught rakia means firmament.
Firmament, yes. None of us ever know what firmament means. Absolutely. What's the translation of firmament? So firmament means a dome over earth. It means a physical dome over earth, absolutely in line with what the world looks like to us, by the way. When we look at this, it looks like there's a dome over Earth, and what ancient thinkers believed. And there's a whole literature about how to explain the sort of cosmology of a firmament-based universe, in which I mentioned this when we were looking at the passage of the sun. I think the debates are, when we looked at the influence of science on Chazal, we looked at the Gemara in Psachim, which spoke about what's the passage of the sun. Does the sun go under the earth at night, or does the sun go behind the Rakia? I didn't then use the word Rokia because I didn't want to get into this discussion. So I spoke about this model of a dome in which the sun goes behind the dome. By the way, this is reflected in the Nusach about Tefillah. We talk about Peseach Chalonos Rokia. What's the language we have in davening? Hashem opening up the windows of the Rokia in order to, because there was a cosmological view in which the dome's windows are opened up to allow the sun to get in and out, or to allow the stars to get through, and so on and so forth. So Rav Hirsch uses this example when he speaks at Rokia. He speaks about, and he says again, this is simply Duplitura Colossians. The Torah is speaking to the language of men, to how the universe appeared to humanity at the time. And this is acceptable because the Torah has to address a particular audience. If we would expect the Torah to be a scientific world book, in the 21st century, it would have to be, in the beginning, there was a Big Bang, and then there was plasma, and the plasma coalesced into electrons, and so on and so forth. This would have made no sense to anyone, more than 50 years ago. Perhaps makes no sense to any of us even now, because these things are very difficult. And wouldn't make any sense, by the way, to anyone in the year 2300 either, because presumably by then, the whole scientific terminology and understanding would have moved forward. So what language would you want the Torah to adopt, other than the language of humans and the language of the Makabli Torah? HaKadosh Baruch is about time and space, but the recipients of Torah aren't above time and space. So says Reb Shimshon Falhash in his language. Another example of this, and with this I'll finish, is the use of the kloyos, the kidneys, as a metaphor for human reason. No one now thinks that reason resides in the kidneys. None of us relate to reason residing in the kidneys. We experience and we feel the seat of consciousness as either in our minds or in our hearts. Right? When you ask someone to point to themselves, they do still point to the heart often, because this is where we feel emotion and we feel tension, or my heart's beating fast if I'm excited or if I'm scared, and so on and so forth. So we conceive of the seat of our emotions as one of those two places. We don't experience it in the Colossians, and we don't think that scientifically in Colossians are the place where reason resides. Now, there are many psukim that use Koloyos as the seat of reason. Some of them again have entered into the text of Tefillah. So there's a pasuk in Yeshaya, Perik Yod Aleph, Boichin Koloyos v'leiv. Hashem tzavokos shofet tzedek. Hashem is a judge, a righteous judge. Boichin Koloyos v'leiv. That's a phrase that you may remember from the Yom Rome. He investigates the Koloyos and the leiv, investigates the heart and the kidneys. Now all of us squirm when Koloyos are used as the seat of decision making. None of us squirm when we use the leiv. Right, we all understand my heart wants this, because in the 21st century, we still relate to the heart as the seat of reason, even though we know biologically and logically it's not, but we don't relate to the kloyos. So you'll never have anyone asking or being super bothered by, why does the Torah talk about Hashem weighing up the decisions of the heart, because that's a metaphor we still ring to. And therefore, even though we understand it's a metaphor, there we go very easily with Duplitura Colossians. When it comes to Koloyos, it sounds like it's something dodgy. How can it be? And again, there are in the school of the Mekabolim, there are those that speak about the biological function of Koloyos as separating, filtering the blood and cleansing it, and therefore this is the way in which it means reason and so on. But the simplest understanding of the matter is that Koloyos at the time was a metaphor for reason, because at the time they saw and related to the Koloyos, the kidneys, as the seat of human decision making, and this is no longer a metaphor that we ring to anymore, and therefore we're no longer we're bothered by that. Again, the Torah Colossians, the Torah was addressing an audience that they spoke to. Again, there may be other explanations. I'm not disagreeing with the more Kabbalistic interpretation. I'm simply saying this is a legitimate reading of the Psukim. I'll stop there because I think we've had enough weeks on this matter. Yes, someone's posting here about where space starts and so on. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that, but thank you for that. Thank you for that comment, Andrew. So we'll stop there for today, and I hope anyway that's offered some insight into what the Torah SheBichtav is, a far more dangerous and difficult topic than the impact of science and culture on Chazal, but nonetheless one that deserves to be expressed. I hope that this has only increased our Yerusha Shemaim. It's not intended to do anything other than that. As I said, next week we've got Hanukkah themed topic. The week after that we'll be away in Poland, and then after that we will resume our series, and I'm open to suggestions of topics. Thank you so much to all of you for joining, and if I won't see you before Hanukkah, some of you, so I wish you all a Hanukkah Sameach and a good Hanukkah.
Did you say I feel it in my gut?
Feel it in my gut, yeah, we do use some language, yes. Thank you.